It says we're live.
All right, welcome back. Hopefully you had good discussions in your breakout rooms. You should all be using the chat to let us know what your recommendations are. I'm not seeing any coming in yet. Are you, Frederick?
No, I haven't seen much, but we have had some ice in the air out, so I don't know if we should get started.
Yeah.
While we wait for more questions to come in. So I think the consensus also, listening on the discussions now and judging from the discussion forum in the platform, where we had 27% of the students saying that they should start with SNOP, that when they should start with an SNOP process. That seems to be the most common recommendation. I don't know what you say about
it's
that.
kind of interesting. And so we were talking before, and it might be because that was the last thing you were taught. And that's always worrisome that it's they call it what's the name of it?
Primacy.
Primacy. There's another one. There's another name for it. But anyway, remembering the most recency bias. And so, but you know, long-term SNOP, absolutely, it's a very dysfunctional company, right? If you look at it, they tend to operate in different areas. If you picked up on some of her notes, and although some people critiqued Wendy for not taking detailed notes, I thought that was interesting. The real thing you should have picked up on is that they don't really talk to each other, or they tend to work independently. And so an SNOP process would be perfect for that. However, does it make sense to do that right away? I think what I talked about when we had that lesson is that it is very complicated to put together because of the personalities. So you have to ask yourself a couple questions. Is Wendy the right person to do it? She's new to the company. She's junior. She's a director. She's maybe a peer, but she doesn't know any of the people. She has no credibility. And so to get people together to run an SNOP, usually you have to have someone who can command respect and force things to happen, because people won't naturally say, oh yes, let's all work together, because someone's ox will get gored, right? Whenever you have a system optimal, which SNOP drives to, trade-offs have to be made. And Wendy is not in the position, I would appear from looking at what we presented you, to be able to make those decisions. So long-term, it's a good idea. So maybe what this would mean, and so if you think about it, who do you think would be the best one to run that? And my recommendation would be Raj. That's actually, Raj is really the person here who should have been taking care of this earlier. The fact that no one is really talking to each other. So perhaps when you could recommend to Raj to start this SNOP process, or maybe just getting together to talk, because it seemed like a lot of the problems were that they just weren't talking to each other. They were coming up with meals. They weren't talking to sourcing about how easy it is to get stuff. Forecasting was being made without talking to anyone. Same thing with the marketing, reduction, pricing, and those kind of things were done without talking to other people and how they affect. So yes, long-term SNOP, but we asked short-term.
We have 4 groups now recommending them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. Okay. So SNOP and long term, it makes sense, right? It's still a good thing to do, but not at this point, and maybe not Wendy should be the person driving it.
But also there's some halfway steps. So one of the things is to get people to talk to each other. So this is the weird thing, the fun thing about supply chains, right? So we can go through the technical way of doing this in the process, but it's all about people at the end of it, right? And so just getting people normally talking to each other is an amazing thing. And we've done a lot of work here, and actually Roberto ran a lot of this, where we had project simulations done with people across our 4 different centers across the globe. And it's amazing how they perform before and after they physically meet each other. Same thing applies here. Once you have a beer with someone or go out after hours with someone, you have a better working relationship. And so one thing she can do as a half step to this, rather than say, we're going to do a formal SNOP process, is to start having, weekly meetings, get together to people to complain about what they do, what works, and maybe some things can get solved that way. However, for first initiatives, though, probably not the first thing to do, because it would take probably 6 months to even get the process and things going. So what is the next common one?
Yes, so the next common one, I think, judging from the Hangout now, 2 rooms, I think room 4 and 6, they were talking about new kitchens. So redesigning the network and thinking about how many kitchens, where to put the kitchens, that might be a good way to drive down the escalating costs.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. So hopefully by now, if I gave you numbers, and I think I probably gave you enough, you could figure it out. You could run developed the mixed integer linear program to determine which of the three, Sacramento, Bakersfield, and Fresno. And so for each of those, you'd have to guess at your inbound costs. That's the tricky thing, because I didn't give you any information. Most of the materials comes from right in that whole valley right there in California. So it might not change too much. Your outbound distances, right? And so you could do an optimization. You would have to find out some other information. We don't give you any information about kitchen costs beyond a per unit, but we know that there's going to be some kind of fixed cost for opening a new kitchen. So you can think about some of the other things you would need to find out is the cost of a new kitchen. Are there economies of scale to a kitchen? So it might be not that there's just a fixed cost and a variable cost. That variable cost might be tapering off, similar to how we see the inventory, kind of a square root rule, because as there tends to be economies to scale to a kitchen, to any kind of operation. So maybe it's better to have one big one. The other thing to think about is, okay, let's say I have 2 or 3, or go to the extreme. I think Linda Chin recommended going to one in every city. Right. So that's kind of an extreme. And hopefully you should figure out that would probably be a disaster, right? Because, yeah, you'd push your local delivery would go down, but your line haul would get much longer. And now I'm instead of risk pooling, I'm depooling, right? Because now I'm going to have to guess how much has to go to each kitchen to satisfy its individual demand. And so if you think it's hard to forecast demand across the whole network, then think of how complicated it would be for each city, because you would have to do that for the kitchens. So what would probably make sense is 1, maybe 2, whether it makes sense in Sacramento or the other locations. Bakersfield and Fresno are more central. Maybe it makes sense to do 2, but you'd have to get a little more information. And then as soon as you break up from having one main one to 2 separate ones, then you've got to worry about complexity. Can you actually manage 2 at one time? So there's a lot of hard numbers that you would need to get, but then also some soft numbers. But it would probably be worth having a network design to actually use to discuss different options, whether when Linda recommends something or if the CEO, John Bush, does as well.
So do you see this as something they should do in the short term, or is this a long-term initiative?
I view that as a midterm, maybe mid to longer term. I would not do that right away because, again, that would take another 5-6 months. And so part of the things about joining any organization, you guys think about if you join an organization or if someone comes to you, you don't know them. And so they've got to prove themselves. So one of the things that you might want to be looking for, that Wendy should be looking for, is low-hanging fruit. What is the low-hanging fruit that'll give me some credibility, show that I can do some stuff, and get things moving?
Yes, so group 3 mentioned transportation, and that's something we saw in the discussion forum in the platform also. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now.
It's 18%.
18%, yeah, one of the most common suggestions. And clearly, it seems like transportation costs are pretty expensive to some of the newer cities.
Yeah, and so if you guys ran some numbers, hopefully you ran some numbers. I know some of the comments were, it's expensive or it probably costs more. As we do more of these cases, and as we go to other classes for SC3 and SC4, you'll see more cases like this because it will start shifting from pure numbers that we see in SC0, 1, and 2 to more softer issues. But you still have to always run the numbers. If we didn't run the numbers, then it would just be Harvard, right, instead of MIT. So we, if you look at this, the fixed cost and variable costs, there's actually 3 types of ways delivery that the product is being delivered. There's local delivery, right? And then Sacramento, I gave a cost per box for that. It's kind of an all-in. For the established market, San Francisco and San Jose, we did pooling, and hopefully you remember that from SC1X, where it was a line haul down and then a local delivery. Now, I think I put as one of the recommendations, should we readjust the pool point location within San Francisco and San Jose? That was a red herring, because that would save you pennies, maybe. It's a cool problem. It'd be fun to solve, and you know how to solve it. It's a facility location problem, and you can find center of gravity and that stuff, but that's probably not a big one. The big ones were what we were doing for the new cities, the 4 new cities, and that was where they were using essentially an all-in LTL company. And so the question is, why would someone do that? And typically it makes sense if you only have 1 or 2. If they're very small, they're very new, you don't know how big the business is going to be, it takes care of itself. But at some point, once the scale gets big enough, it's time to revisit. And if you ran the numbers, I was showing that the current cost per box, transportation cost per box for Sacramento, San Francisco, and San Jose range from $5.50 to $7 a box. That's the transportation cost, to include the handling and the line haul and local. And it doubled that for the other ones. I gave you the cost, 16, 18, 21, and 22. And so it's dramatically higher. And if you looked at the new estimates that for the sales in the next 6 months, which we'll talk about in a second, that came from marketing, it would just dramatically increase. So the transportation budget goes from about $208,000 to $334,000 a week, which is tremendous. And so it's almost goes from $7 to $12 a box, because the problem is the big growth areas, if you accept Linda's forecasting, are the most expensive ones, where you're actually losing money on those boxes. So renegotiating, you have some options. And so this is the question.
Yeah, so how should you do it? If you were to, let's say we agree it's a problem, right? So how would you go about? What's the right way to reduce those costs?
So if this was a real case study, this is the questions I'd be asking all of you, and we'd get some debate going. But there's some options. I know. So you could do a bid, just a pure out bid. And the question is, would you bid out the San Francisco and San Jose lanes at the same time? Probably. What about the inbound? If you look back at your notes, the inbound is not being inbound transportation, that is from the farms and all that stuff into the kitchen, is not handled by Dougie. It's handled by procurement. This is a common situation in many companies. The inbound and the outbound are not coordinated. So you could do, one option is run a bid for everything. The second is use the existing one, which I called, the fish.
KC Fish?
Yeah, KC Fish instead of JB Hunt. KC Fish, we already have something negotiated with them, right? You already have a fixed cost for anything within 1,000 miles. And if you look at it, nothing is more than 1,000 miles. So you have some existing contracts you can work with. And so you have some options there. My personal recommendation is that I would go with the existing contractor, because that gives you some flexibility. You can make that switch almost immediately, assuming you'd have to check that you don't have anything with Ace Trucking already pre-negotiated. You also have to look at something else. If you switch to that KC Fish, then you've got to handle the loading yourself, and you've got to set up some more pooling. So it takes a little more work that falls under Dougie if you think Dougie can handle it, right? Because the nice thing about what Ace was doing, yes, it was expensive, but you didn't have to think about it. It was completely outsourced. Now you got to think about it. But the savings, as I estimated, were, boy, it cut it from 786 to cut 60, almost cut it in half, if I looked at that right. And especially with the growth actually, your cost per box doesn't grow as fast. So it seems like it would be it would make a ton of sense to do. If you look at the blended across, it goes from what, 51, what is it, the current fixed cost per box would be under 60. Yeah, blended.
Going from 70 to 60.
Yeah.
So you can ask it, and do you see any risk? So what you're suggesting is that they will put all their transport with one vendor. All transportation is with KC Fish. Do you see any risk in using just one vendor?
It could be, but this is what's known as, it's really short haul moves. And so all of these moves would be a pretty straightforward move. Now, the problem is going all the way to Phoenix. The distance there could get a little tricky, right? So what was that distance?
500.
Yeah, 755 miles. That's more than a day, right? And so that might require a refrigerated truck. You might want to do something a little differently for that. You can generally drive 500 miles in a day. So that's getting a little shaky. If you look at the map, Sacramento's very far north, and you're serving farther south. So this might lead to an idea that maybe you want to have a lower kitchen, something more central, the Bakersfield, because if you could run the numbers, you'd see that the distance, it cuts off probably 400 miles for most of the shipments. So it's another thing to consider.
Yeah, because as a follow-up, I have also, and that's something that was posted in the discussion forum. Do you see any risk? Let's say you go into this transportation bid and you get a new contract where you promise certain volumes on all these line hauls that you've been purchasing. And then next step, you say on the medium term, we want to look at the network redesign, and we decide to open a kitchen in, let's say, Bakersfield. That means our volume going to change in the network. The volumes are going to change. So what's going to happen with the contract with Case of Fish?
Yeah, so typically in transportation, every country is a little different. But in the U.S., what you would do is if the business changes, transportation contracts are never guaranteed volume. They're just not, because there's no guarantee that the volume on each lane is going to be exactly the same. So typically what you do is you try to get a certain amount of volume, and at the end of the contract period, you renegotiate for what the next term is going to be. So because you're not going to guarantee the volume to the carrier will not always guarantee that they'll have a truck available for you. Now, for stuff like this, like local delivery, because you're using them every day essentially, then you can almost consider, and you might want to think about going to more of a dedicated arrangement. And that's almost what you have here with them, where you're setting up, they have daily runs. And so let's say if you switch your network, what you can do, what typically happens is you allow them to rebid or be involved in the redesigned network. You're still going to need trucking, and so instead of everything from Sacramento, maybe everything from Bakersfield, but you let them apply the business. So it's something that you can negotiate through, but generally it's not an issue if things change.
Okay, so let's move on to something I think group or room 2 and a few other people suggested also. It's about forecasting.
Oh yeah.
And in the discussion forum, 17% of the people thought that forecasting should be the first initiative, and it's tied to the waste. They have a big waste problem. It's been increasing over the last year. So what do you say about forecasting?
Yeah, it's a challenge, right? But I believe if you looked at the case, they said the aggregate forecasting, like for number of meals, is pretty stable. That's actually fairly good accuracy. But the problem is if you have 5 meals or 6 meals out there, and you might think it's even across the board, one might sell 80% of it. And this is, as I talk to real companies, this is the real problem. Aggregate demand, as you would guess, is easier because you're pooling. But as you get more and more separate, as you have more and more disaggregated, then you have higher forecasting errors. So the question is, will you ever get better at it? Yes. Can you ever get better? And that's a challenge. You can probably be better than just having one person guess, right? Where that's Lisa is just kind of guessing what it is. So yeah, you can look at that, and that'd be an initiative to try to tighten up. So the question is, how would you fix that? I would probably do it by collecting more data on what sells, and then bringing in some of the other team members to that, both marketing as well as procurement.
So some kind of a focus group type of.
Yeah, and so it's something that probably can go away from the nutritionist, away from Lisa, and maybe be run. Actually, it's something that Wendy could probably run. But it's not an easy fix, and it won't mean that all the waste goes away. Because if I remember correctly, the waste, a lot of that was caused by the not using the same ingredient for very long. And so that raises the other question that maybe it's just maybe a little better coordination, because we're forecasting at multiple different things, right? There's the number of meals, and that's all that Dougie cares about, right? Transportation, all they care is number of meals. Then as you get down to the number of which type of meal, then you get into what the kitchen cares about and what procurement cares about. But really, then as you look at what the bill of materials, that translates into raw ingredients. And so this brings up, and I think a lot of people brought up the idea of modularity.
Yes, yeah.
What if I have the same 6 ingredients in each of the meals? What if every meal was only 1 ingredient, right? That would make life so much easier for all of us supply chain guys. And this is where you have a trade-off, because the marketing guys, and they'll want to have as much diversity as possible, because you want to capture as much demand and make sure people are happy. On the other extreme, the supply chain guys would rather serve, everyone gets vanilla pudding, right? That's it, because it's easy to move and it's one. You don't have to worry about different types of SKUs. So in between that, you've got to try to negotiate. There is probably a lot of room there to get the procurement and the kitchen meal design to talk to each other. Again, having informal discussions could help a lot, because then you can try to synchronize, here's what I'm thinking about for meals, and maybe not all the same ingredients, but maybe from the same vendor. And you can start thinking along those terms.
But that starts to sound more and more like an S&OP process.
Yeah, it gets to it. And so the question, do you need to formally start an S&OP practice and make it come up with the rules and everything? Eventually you want to do that, but you probably need to start breaking the ice and getting people to talk, because just forcing people to sit around a table, especially if no one has the decision-making authority to do things, it won't help things. So, and almost Wendy could facilitate the thaw in the relations. That's something that could be done to make it a little more informal.
Okay, another type of waste is also discussed in the case, and that has to do with the packaging, the wrapping, the boxes.
Yeah.
Is that something that should be addressed at all, or is that very much into the future, something to think about in terms of designing, when you design the meal or the boxes?
Mm-hmm.
Should I think about this in your...
I also put that in almost as a red herring, and I think, Roberto, you added more to that when you added in the whole recycling thing. Because this is the real case. I've actually used a couple of these different services, and there's one where it goes back. So let's step back. So there's pre-prepared, partially pre-prepared meals. They do reduce total food waste dramatically. If any of you are single or just with 2 or 3 people in the household, it's very hard to buy small ingredients for one meal or something. You have to buy a lot, and you tend to, if you've got leftovers, you tend to have larger food waste. The service comes in with exactly the amount of food you have. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of packaging waste. So the question is, should we recycle it and send it back? It's something to think about. I've used some services where they do that. That increases the cost, right? Because 1, you've got that, you're paying for that transportation back. 2, the packaging has to be very different now. It has to be reusable. It's much sturdier, which means it's heavier. It's heavier coming in. And so I used one service, I won't say its name, but it was the whole box with drawers and everything. But it was so heavy. You had to take it down and put it back down, and then the delivery service would pick it up the next day or so. So you got to look at it, whether it's worth it or not. As far as if you want to establish that it's, because it's not going to save you money. It's not going to save you money. Now, it might make you more appealing to be earth-friendly, environmentally conscious, or you could try to reduce the packaging that you try to have within there. There's always going to be this trade-off, though. As I make the packaging thinner and thinner, the probability of damage goes up, because the purpose of packaging is to protect the goods. As I make that thinner and less waste, you have a trade-off. You might have more damage. So you've got to think about that. So you could put it in. It would have to be an initiative that would have more side benefits. It is never going to save you money, but it's something that could be incorporated. Okay. And so you would have to figure a way to do the local collection and then also the line haul back. And so that's something that could very easily be done. It just takes more coordination.
Because it should probably be spare capacity in the local delivery to be able to bring it back too, right?
They could, and so
be too expensive.
What's happened before, there's some services that I've seen where they deliver every day. And so there's one called Fresh Diet in the US, and they deliver prepared meals in a little refrigerated pouch. It looks like it's about this big and it's whatever. They deliver it out and they take the last one in. So it makes it a lot more complicated for delivery because they've got to drop and pick, but you can do it. It's more expensive. And then they have what's known as the transportation balance problem, is that some people forget to return them. And so you go through and you're not returning, then you put 7 of them down there. And the guy delivering it is in a small van. He doesn't have room for them. So as soon as you bring this reverse logistics in, you increase the balance problem. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do. I'm not anti-green or anything, but it's not an effort that will reduce your costs. It would increase costs. So you just have to make sure it's got to be a strategic initiative or something that the company wants to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So we're almost running out of time. Do we want to touch upon payment terms before
Sure.
we close? Because I think that was one of the alternatives that we had a lot of people voting for in the discussion forum.
Yeah, that could be an easy thing, because what do they do now? They pay on receipt, which is insane. There's companies out there that have 120-day payment terms. And so you guys know what happens when I increase my payment terms. That's more cash flow. And that's tremendous. As you increase that cash to cash, or shorten the cash to cash conversion cycle, That's what you really want to do. Now, these are small vendors usually, so that's going to be harder to do 120-day terms. That's a rare thing. But 30 days, 15 days, 60 days, it's doable. And so one way you can do this, and I don't know if Jared talked about this or Jim when he did his lesson, and a lot of companies do this. The large retailers will do this. They'll set up terms. My normal payment terms are 60 days, but if you want to be paid faster, say 15 to 20, then it takes a certain cut. But we can pay you faster. And so you have two tiers. And so you have fast payment because small vendors are more concerned about their cash cycle time. The larger vendors, they're willing to pay in longer terms to get paid because they don't need the cash as much. And so it's just a trade-off. So I would recommend that to be a very fast thing to do as well.
Yeah,
that could almost
that
be
sounds
one
like
of
a
the first
short-term,
things.
short-term gain.
But the challenge is that the tension, because everything here is tensions, right? Is that they want to use small organic farms. And the challenge is if you say we're going to do 90-day payment terms, they'll just go out of business or they'll stop selling to you. And so you've got to be, make sure you pick the right terms to match the vendor's size and their situation. Because this is what happened in trucking a lot with the recession. When payment terms went longer, you can see a lot of companies go bankrupt because they don't have the cash to hand that cycle.
Okay, anything else? I think we're a couple of minutes after 11.
Okay.
Do we want to wrap this up?
Yeah, any other comments coming in on the chat? Anything that people thought that Wendy should do or anything? Any comments on, I know John Bush had.
Sell the company.
Sell the company. Are you kidding? It's a gold mine. It's a gold mine. This is a hot area right now.
Talk about increasing product portfolio.
Yeah, so some discussion with the CEO, John Bush, had a bunch of recommendations about doing big things, right? Go to the East Coast and start selling wine and all this stuff. And so this is typical because that's why he's the big, visionary for this. And Wendy has to be careful about how you handle this. You don't want to just squash everything, but the best way, and I think we talked about this, is facts-based advice. And so run the numbers and say, okay, here's what it would take. The whole idea of adding wine and other things into it, like ice cream, that requires a whole nother level of refrigeration. The temperature control is much more rigid for that. Introducing liquor, wine, that's a whole regulatory thing. So it opens a whole can of worms, whether you can or can't do it. So it's all about how to handle these different ideas coming from your boss. It's not necessarily, you can't just say, no, that's a really stupid idea. You have to say, well, here's why it might not make sense now.
So you shouldn't be afraid to criticize as long as you have good arguments.
Should never be afraid. You should always be able to deliver criticism as long as it's delivered correctly.
Okay.
All right.
Anything else you want to wrap up about the short versus long term? What you should do? Just
No, I think we covered most of it. Roberto, anything you want to add that you took from it?
No, I think you hit most of the
Okay.
recommendations. We never heard from room 5 though.
Room 5, what have you been doing?
They have a similar.
That's okay. You can continue to use the discussion forum. I wanted to use this a little bit to give some kind of a live feel to it. Typically, this is handled in a Socratic method where you would all be sitting there and I wouldn't be doing any talking. I would just be asking you guys what to do. It's harder to do in this format. So we just wanted to try this out, see how it works. And what we'll do is I'll keep the breakout rooms open for the next couple hours. I'll close it in about 2 hours. But feel free to go back and discuss. And please use the discussion forum. Continue the discussion. You'll see more of these types of case studies in SC3X if you take that, and SC4X. And maybe some of them filtering back into the other courses as we continue to develop them. But I hope you enjoyed it. It's realistic-ish. It's not a real situation, but it's pretty realistic as far as the situations that occur. All right. Thanks, guys.
thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Stopping.